trade unions, COSATU, will tomorrow embark on a one-day socio-economic national strike. The strike is being held to put pressure on both government and the private sector to act on issues affecting workers that include corruption, a reversal of budget cuts and a wage freeze in the public service, along with retrenchment in state-owned enterprises. And the Labour Union is also calling for what it sees as an attack directed at workers in blatantly undermining collective bargaining. So to tell us more about this, COSATU's one-day strike, of course, for tomorrow, we're joined by Bheki Ntshalintshali, who's COSATU's General Secretary. Mr. Ntshalintshali, welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakin, and good morning to the viewers at home.
So the country is, of course, still adhering to COVID-19 regulations, even though we are on level 1. So how exactly is the strike going to unfold tomorrow?
It's going to happen in twofold, considering the COVID-19 regulation, that we are going to have a mini protest picket in various areas. We are not looking for mass attendance to those gathering, but we are calling all other workers to stay at home as to a solidarity to those that will be going on the action. So we're looking for a limited number, but we think it will be significant to send a message both to government and to the private sector.
So just getting into the nitty-gritty of it, Mr. Ntshalintshali, as COSATU, you say that government needs to move away from the current neoliberal macroeconomic policy framework and has to introduce strong interventionist measures in the economy that you say should be in line with the country's perspective of a progressive developmental state. So let's talk to that. You know, what are some of those interventions?
There are a number of them. For an example, if you look to the state-owned enterprises, you look to the capacity it has, you look to the personnel that is there, that during our transition, we almost, what you may call it, we purged the people with the skills. And those people have become consultant, they are milking the state, and the state has not been developing that culture of honestly hardworking and capacitated personnel. But in addition, with the cutting in the budget, we've not been able to retain people with the required skills. That is one of the issues that a developmental state, in our view, should do, but also to intervene where is necessary. If you look to some of the state-owned enterprises who have been doing wonderful work in the past. You look to Denel has been the best kind of IT and skills and expertise that is there. Is almost wiped up because we allow corruption. You look at the Transnet, all of those state-owned enterprises, in our view, they are enabling for business to be able to invest. But we have neglected them, and I think there's acknowledgement by the President and the Cabinet that we need to be dealing with those issues as urgently as possible.
Mr. Ntshalintshali, in your statement, you also say, and I want to quote this, it says, on Thursday, we shall be demanding urgent action from policymakers in government and decision makers in the private sector to stop the attacks that are directed at workers. Both the public and private sector have been blatantly undermining collective bargaining. What do you mean by that? Give us examples of how this has been done.
The example, the one that stands above all is when there's an agreement negotiated by the parties, signed agreement made to be legal, implemented halfway, and the people in the leadership just wake up and says, we're no more going to honor that agreement for dubious reasons that are beyond the workers. That is one clear example, that you can't go into negotiation, sign an agreement, make people to compromise with the understanding that this is a long-term investment. And then you just wake up with no good reasons and you move away from it. While on the other hand, you are committed in paper to protecting collective bargaining, that on paper you are members of the International Labour Organization and you have ratified some of this convention. That's what we said it needed to stop, because when government does it, The employers, some employers are also following the steps from government in doing that. We want that commitment. We want people to go to negotiating table whenever there are challenges. There are systems that needed to be followed. For an example, exemption, if you can prove that it's beyond your fiscal, your power to honor that agreement. You do it in an honest way, in a transparent way, and you build trust.
And just with regard to policy development, COSATU is in alliance with the majority party in government. So how is that working for you? Because if COSATU is complaining about some of the policy directions and policy initiatives, what does that mean?
What it means is that the ANC got both the left and the right people in terms of ideology. There are those that will be pushing for privatization, for an example, and there will be those that are pushing for nationalization, and there are those that will be in the middle. COSATU's interest is to ensure that workers' issues are protected, and in that context, we'll go to the meeting, we'll influence them, we win some, we lose some. As it's part of that engagement, even among the ANC people, they will not agree on some of those issues. And we then develop policies. We engage some academic, and where it makes sense, we go to openly and say, here's the policy, try it. Sometimes we win some, sometimes we lose some, and the struggle continues.
So basically, would you say that is then a concession that COSATU is losing in terms of the ability to influence the policy initiatives that government has come up with? Because you go on to say that private sector cartels have stolen billions of rands from businesses, taxpayers, and ultimately from consumers. They've distorted economic markets and have strangled competition, and there's no change in the country's economic policy direction. So why have you been unable to have more muscle and weigh in a little bit more in terms of that economic policy direction that you would like to see government take?
There are a number of reasons for that one. What we must understand all the time, that we are in a capitalist economy. That's a character of the economy that we are in, that they will disinvest, they will look for poor working conditions somewhere else, and if they can find those areas, they will not hesitate to move on. That is the decision that is being made by the private sector. That's why we're engaging them, and we're trying to shift them to some kind of socialist democratic system. We're in a mixed economy. We know and understand it from the beginning that this is what's going to be the struggle. Wherever their trade union exists, they exist because the condition on the ground does not favor workers. That's why we form trade unions to engage. That's why we try also to influence the alliance. But the alliance is not going to be a trade union. They're not going to be fighting for workers. We need to influence one another, and we look at the ANC to be closer to some of the issues that we wanted to have. And we have a number of policies that in the ANC itself we have managed to win. But when you go to the government institutions, you look for treasury, for an example, you'll get that the system does not necessarily implement the resolution that are taken by the ANC. And our role is to engage them, both in terms of the boardroom or in the streets. We are mixing the two. And we make some wins on the others, which will not undermine that there are gains that we're making.
That's an interesting point, because appreciating, of course, the separation between party and state, it still is ultimately ANC policy that one would imagine would triumph. But, you know, we'll get into that at another point where we can park that particular issue and discuss it at greater length.
Yeah.
But I want to ask you about state-owned enterprises, Mr. Ntshalintshali. So with the current operational and financial state of some of our state-owned enterprises, there is a school of thought that believes that privatization may be the solution to rescuing some of these struggling SOEs instead of letting them come to full collapse that obviously affects workers. What's your take on that?
Our take is that if private sector would be interested to buy some of the state-owned enterprises, there would have been a reason for that. And the reason will be that you can turn them around, you can make them profitable, and you can make them to be developmental in nature. So what the private sector is looking for those state-owned enterprises where they know that it got a bright future. What our government should be doing is to understand why everybody would be interested in those issues and try to understand what is wrong. And I think the majority of people, including the private sector, knows what is wrong with our state-owned enterprises is the leadership, which of course, leadership you build, leadership you train, is a question of discipline, is a question of corruption. If we can stop those issues, and in our view, we should be able to address them. Of course, some of the state-owned enterprises may not be relevant now as they were before. That's why we're calling for an open engagement to look holistically to which of the state-owned enterprises may still be relevant. For an example, if there was hotels that were owned by the state for the security forces, or some farms that were bought by the state or belonging to the state for interrogating and harassing people, you may come to the conclusion that in the new democracy, we don't need those state-owned enterprises in that fashion. But you need a transparent engagement with everybody engaged, where you need the expertise, for an example, of the private sector. You have then to discuss whether you can have a private public sector partnership, because you need, and we know that the private sector is looking for interest. If they take over ESCOM, for an example, we know that the prices are going to shoot to the top, and many people are not going to be able to afford.
We're out of time, Mr. Ntshalintshali, but just very briefly, two very brief answers to these questions. Your take on SAA and how that has unfolded, and Mango as well.
Yes, there are reasons for those things, and I think we now have had it through the Zondo Commission, how it was run down, and the people in the leadership, they look to their side instead of focusing on this issue. We have lost the SAA in the form that it is being built from the scratch. We hope lesson learned will not be repeated.
And a very brief basic income grant, what's COSATU's very preliminary stance on that?
I think we have won that debate now within the South African society, and everybody agree that universal social protection is the way to go. The issue here is the question of affordability, and that's what we need to be honestly engaging, how to make it sustainable and how it should be addressing the interest of our people, but not as a permanent factor that we want people to be on social grants. People want to have jobs.
Well, we have to leave it there, Mr. Ntshalintshali. We're out of time. But thanks so much for your time. Bheki Ntshalintshali, COSATU Secretary General, talking to us about the Labour Union's one-day national strike tomorrow to address, of course, among other things, socio-economic issues. And that